So let me start with a story of how I started this journey, I guess. When I was in college, I was overworked and very anxious, and I didn't figure out until senior year that afternoons were a good time to get homework done, so I procrastinated, and then I stayed up all night doing homework, as maybe you have too. And there was one night that I remember distinctly where I was so stressed out and I don't even know what all I had to do. And at 2 in the morning, I said, you know what, I just need to go out and clear my head and go for a short walk. And I did, and I went outside. It was pitch black. I went to a small school. There wasn't a lot of light. And as I was walking, all of a sudden there was this gigantic truck coming out from from a side street and about to hit me, and I jumped out of the way, and I didn't get hurt, and everything was okay. And then I came back to my dorm room, and I'm like, you know what? There couldn't have been a truck there. That street was way, way too small. Like, it just couldn't have worked. And so that's when I really started realizing what I'm doing to myself is really not very healthy and is probably not setting me up for success, and I need to give this some thought. And so that's when I started thinking more about this and reading more about this topic. And you know, these many years later, I'm still on this journey. As my family will attest, I haven't gotten it all figured out, but hopefully there are a few lessons I can share with you today. And hopefully that will start you on your own journey or continue to motivate you. So, just a little bit more about myself. I work at Google. We have a booth outside. Please go check it out during the break. I lead engineering teams, so most of my day is spent thinking about disaster recovery and control planes and failovers and all kinds of things like that. So I can talk about that for ages as well. But I also lead engineering teams. I lead a team right now of about 100 people, a little more depending on how you count. And so a lot of what I do every day is really also thinking about how do these people work together, how do these teams work together, how can I make my org a high-functioning org that works well and delivers a lot of impact. And honestly, a lot of that has to do with people, and people are very complicated. So what we're talking about here today actually feeds very nicely into this. So let's talk a little bit about positive psychology. So I am not a psychologist by training. A lot of this is material that I've read on my own and listened to books and podcasts and things like that about. But you know, there is a lot that we can learn, and I think you know, all of us have been trained to absorb lots of material. And one of the things that I always tell people on my team who are aspiring to be managers, some of them are, is there's a lot to learn, and a lot of people have figured out a lot of things before us, and you don't need to start from scratch. So what is positive psychology? So positive psychology is really, the way to think about it is the psychology of thriving. Like, how do you put yourself and your family and your team and your community in a place where they can thrive? This is what it is not. It is not just giggly fun and, you know, happy hours and things like that, and what people tend to, you know, what Greek philosophers will call hedonism, where the idea is that pleasure is the greatest good. Positive psychology is not only that, right? Positive psychology, like I said, is more about thriving and how can you actually figure out how to be the most successful and the happiest and the best you can be. So let's talk a little bit more about this. So positive psychology, or the psychology of thriving, is really, really not a new concept. So Aristotle talked about this in terms of eudaimonia, which is essentially the same thing. In Aristotelian ethics, the condition of human flourishing or of living well is how this is defined, right? So again, not a very new concept. I am 100% sure that other cultures had similar concepts. But what happened in the Western world, right, as the field of psychology emerged, a lot of the emphasis of psychology was on studying mental illness, right? And essentially, if you look at the top of this image, traditional psychology is about like figuring out how to deal with mental illness and bringing people to a baseline where they're high functioning and doing well. And that's obviously super critical, and that's something that we must pay attention to and must research. But after a while, some people started to realize that, we're really ignoring a lot of what happens to the people that are already starting from a baseline, that are not dealing with mental illness, perhaps, or even have dealt with their mental illness and now want to go beyond it. And that's really what positive psychology is about. So the founders of modern-day positive psychology, Martin Seligman and Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, and I apologize for mispronouncing his name, I'm sure everybody does. I tried. So what they talk about, I put down here on the slide, you can read for yourself. Psychology is also the study of strength and virtue. It is about work, education, insight, love, growth, and play. It tries to adapt what is best in the scientific method to the unique problems that human behavior presents in all its complexity. And so that really gets to the root of what we want to talk about here. And one of the things that you'll see here is he talks specifically about the scientific method. So I am a computer scientist by training, and I read for fun. I read psychology research and other behavioral research. And if you've done this, you will probably note that a lot of the studies say things like the majority of people, or there's a correlation between certain behavior. And what's really important to understand is that doesn't mean that everybody behaves a certain way. As I'm sure you have figured out, people are very complicated and not everybody behaves a certain way. And so even the things that we're talking about here today, some of them may apply to you, some of them maybe not as much, and that's okay. What's really more important or more interesting is, reflecting on that, trying it out, trying some of these techniques, and then seeing what works for you. So I talked, just with this backdrop, let's talk a little bit about how all of this applies to work, right? Because we're here, this is a professional conference. We want to think about how that applies to work. And it was already mentioned before in this quote that I gave, yes, this is actually predictive of how well people thrive at work and how well teams function together. So if you're an engineer who works on my team and you come to me and you say, you want to be a manager, then I will say, interesting, let's have a little chat. And I will ask you why you want to be a manager. If you tell me it's because you haven't been coding for a while, that's not the correct answer. So really, managing is a different kind of job, and it really requires people to spend a lot more time thinking about all of these dynamics between people, which I find endlessly fascinating, but perhaps it's not for everyone. So if you are a manager, you may have seen some of these models, several models, and including the ones that I put up here. And they actually really tie into a lot of what we're talking about that comes out of the psychology research. So the one on the left talks about individuals. And you see here the x-axis is attitude, the y-axis is performance and capability. And it essentially models how you can think about how well somebody is doing in their current role, right? Are they challenged too much, perhaps? Are they a star, which is the top right corner, which is what we're striving towards? So you can think for yourself where you fit in this, and if you're a manager, you definitely spend time thinking about your team and where they fit on these axes. What's really important is that this actually also applies to teams. So some of you may have seen this model here on the right, which is about teams and how they come together, how they form, how they go through a period of strife, which is the storming phase here, where everybody kind of tries to figure out what is my role in this team and who kind of calls the shots and where do I fit in. And then they come together and they finally become high-performing teams, and where they can execute well, deliver impact before they finally adjourn. So these models, again, are models that are often taught in leadership training, and you may have seen them. And they're actually quite well backed by some of the research that we're talking about here. I put a quote here at the top of the slide, in part because I want to put in a plug for a book that I read that really inspired me. The book is called The Happiness Advantage: How a Positive Brain Fuels Success in Work and Life. I really had fun reading this book, so I recommend it. And the quote is, "Happiness is not the belief that we don't need to change, it is the realization that we can." So please take a look, if you're inspired by this, take a look at this book. There's a lot to learn there. So if you read about positive psychology, you'll find that, different people kind of try to get their heads around the different dimensions of how all of this fits together. And there are different ways of breaking this down and breaking down these dimensions. One of those models is called Perma, and that's a pretty popular one. So I will talk about it here in this context. Perma, like I said, is only one of the ways you can think about the different axes that come into play here. But I find it to be a useful one. So let's stick with that for now. So what is PERMA? PERMA stands for positive emotion, engagement, relationships, meaning, and accomplishments. So we'll talk about each of these in turn, and we'll talk a little bit about what they mean, and what you can do to put yourself in a position to get them, right? As you may guess, and this is a good thing, PERMA predicts the flourishing of communities, organizations, and nations. And it has a positive correlation with physical health, job satisfaction, life satisfaction, and so forth. So this is really important stuff, right? So now, if you're a cynic, then you will come and you will say, okay, great. So if I have positive emotions and great meaning and a lot of accomplishments, then I will be successful, which seems backwards, right? So I'm here to tell you it's not quite that simple, right? So there are ways that we can actually work to put ourselves in a better position to have all of these things that I mentioned here. That's what we'll be talking about. And then we'll talk a little bit also about willpower, because some of the things that you need to do in order to put yourself in a better position to get these things is you need to have willpower. And you can learn that too. So it's sort of turtles all the way down. One quick note. I will publish the slides with the speaker notes, and in the speaker notes I have references, so if you want to do more reading afterwards, I put references in there as well. Okay, so learning positivity. When I started on this journey, I was definitely not an optimist. I guess I'm more optimistic today, that's for sure. I didn't necessarily always have a positive outlook. And one of the key things here is that this is something you can train and you can learn. It is not true that, if you're a pessimist, then you're doomed to a life of pessimism. If that's something that you want to work on, you can actually. It's going to require work and time and investment, but it can be learned. And then, as we saw before, it puts you in a better position for these other effects, which then in turn set you up for success. Okay, let's dive in. Positive emotion. What is positive emotion? So if you think about positive emotion, that can mean obviously a lot of things. What it doesn't necessarily only mean is, ignoring everything bad that's going on and just, giggling and having fun and getting drunk, right? That's not necessarily what this means. Positive emotion can be a range of different kinds of emotions, as we'll see, but I'll just start with a very small example. It can be small things too, right? So for myself, when I have a difficult day ahead at work, I have a lot of meetings, and sometimes I have, presentations that are perhaps tricky or something that I'm not necessarily looking forward to. after I drop off my daughter at school, I think about two things. Number one, my commute, and number two, breakfast. And so both of those actually put me in a good frame of mind. The commute, it's a 15-minute drive, and it's literally the only time of the day where nobody expects anything from me. So I actually really like it. And then breakfast, I love to eat, so, you know. So those are the two things that I'm like, okay, let's just think about those two things. I'm gonna enjoy my commute, I'm gonna enjoy breakfast, and then I will tackle the day. And just that small, reflection helps me. So maybe it's something that you can try for yourself. Okay, so positive emotion, what is it? The way it's, again, like if you read the literature, different people, name different kinds of words, but you can think about sort of the spectrum of positive emotions: joy, gratitude, serenity, interest, hope, pride, amusement, inspiration, awe, and love. And so that obviously runs the gamut of everything that you might think about. And one of the things that I want you to reflect for yourselves is, sometimes I ask people, do you have, how do you feel about work? Do you get positive emotions at work? And, depending on who you talk to, a lot of people will say, oh, I don't know, I guess, sometimes. But I would posit that a lot of us actually get more of this at work than we even admit to ourselves. I'll give you another example for myself. Now that we finished breakfast. One of the projects that I worked on a couple of years ago it was actually a very difficult project. We tried for a couple of years to get it off the ground. It was difficult, it involved a variety of different teams. It was technically very challenging, and so it was easy to just kind of give up and throw our hands in the air. And we finally managed to get it off the ground. And what I mean by that is we came together, we had a credible plan. We got the different teams bought into it. We had milestones, and we kind of knew, yes, if we do this and we stick to it, we can actually make progress here and land this thing. And what happens then is like you get in a room and you see, once you start hitting the first milestones, you see how people feel, right? And they're just excited and they're proud that we finally managed to do this. And they have a range of positive emotions, and the energy in the room is just really good. So reflect for yourselves. Maybe you get more of this at work than you already thought you did. So now the question is, what can you do to have more positive emotions, right? You can work on a project and get lucky that we finally, or work hard and finally get it off the ground. But if you again, read a little bit the literature, one of the most concrete things that people advise is a practice of gratitude. Okay, so what does this mean? Gratitude means you sit back and you think about, what is it that I'm grateful for? It's pretty simple, right? So, people say, write down 3 things that you're grateful for every day. Right? At the end of the day, reflect back, what am I grateful for? Okay. People recommend writing gratitude letters to people, even if you don't send them, like write down why you're grateful for them. So I don't do this super explicitly myself, but I do spend a lot of time thinking about, like, on my morning run, the sun is beautiful and things like that. So there's a lot of research going on right now in this, and I read this one paper where they were trying to figure out, is there, I'm skeptic too, is this causal or is there a correlation? There's definitely a very positive correlation between gratitude and people having positive emotions and feeling better. The research is still torn, right? For sure, it doesn't hurt to have gratitude, but it's not entirely clear if this is fully causal, but it doesn't hurt. So why not? Give it a try. Okay, so let me tell you another thing. So I talked about, when I have a hard day ahead of work, I think about my commute and breakfast. And this is actually, turns out, when I was reading The Happiness Advantage, which is the book I just recommended, they had a study on this, which I found fascinating. that sort of validated what I was doing intuitively. And the study said they had 2 groups of doctors, and the task was that doctors had to diagnose a patient. So they were like given a file with like symptoms and background and whatever else, and they had to come to a diagnosis. And they had the control group and the study group, and they measured how quickly they would reach the correct conclusion. And so the control group did this the way they normally would, and the study group, the only difference was that they were given candies ahead of time, okay? So they were given candies, but they weren't even allowed to eat them because they were like, we don't want to mess with your blood sugar because that's going to mess with our study, so here's your candy, don't eat it, and now do this task. And so the people that got the candy and didn't eat it actually performed much, much better. Why? The hypothesis is because they were in a positive frame of mind. So the answer is not eat candy all the time. It's more complicated than that, but I think the takeaway really is that even small things can set you up for success. The flip side of that is certainly also true, and I'm sure many of you have experienced that, which is, you know, when you rattle somebody, like, you know, if somebody is about to give a presentation and you say, oh, you're probably going to mess it up and you're such a terrible speaker, they're probably not going to do very well, right? So I had, this happened to me recently. I did like a mini experiment with my colleagues. I was sitting down for lunch in the cafeteria, and this colleague approached me whom I hadn't seen in a couple of years, you know, because COVID. And he asked me how I was doing, and I was like right in the middle of this difficult thing that I was trying to figure out. And I said, I'm doing fine, but right now I'm struggling with this one thing. And this person was pretty dismissive, right? It was like, you know, you shouldn't say that that's hard, and it's really important, and you should be able to do it, basically. And it made me feel not very good, obviously, and the rest of the conversation didn't go very well, right? Okay, so this person left, and then I sat there and I still hadn't finished my lunch, and another person showed up. And this second person is actually somebody who's like quite intimidating, often. But he sat down, started talking to me, and I'm like, maybe I overreacted. Like maybe I didn't do this right with this other person, so I'm gonna say the exact same thing now. So this person sat down and said, how are you doing? And I'm like, exact same thing, I'm doing fine, but right now I'm struggling with this. And the second person was like super supportive immediately, and like built that rapport between us, and tried to help me puzzle through it, and made all the difference in the world, as you may imagine, right? So why is this important? It's important because what you say to your colleagues really, really matters, right? Like it's not just, it's as a leader, obviously it matters what we say to our teams, but even as everybody who we interact with, how we put them, the frame of mind we put them in really, really makes a big difference. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about what kinds of things you can do to induce positive emotions. So we talked about candy, that's probably a very short-term solution. If you want longer-term solutions, one of the running themes you will see here today is exercise and meditation, sleeping well, eating healthy, that sort of thing. And it's actually, it just shows up over and over and over and over again, right? So you might say, yes, I kind of already knew this was good for me. Maybe what you didn't know is that this will actually help you have more positive emotions and all of these other things that we're talking about. And those things are actually predictors of success, right? So, you know, I happen to like exercise as much as I like breakfast. And we'll talk about meditation later. But these are the kinds of things that will show up again over and over and over again. Using your strengths is an interesting one that also shows up in this literature a lot. So using your strengths is basically like, what are your character strengths? What are you good at intuitively? There are surveys out there that you can take for free. And essentially what's being found is that if people do the things that they already like naturally gravitate to, they will feel better. It's not super unintuitive, but you know, go figure out what your strengths are. I went and took one of those strengths finders. In fact, I had to do it twice because I forgot what my strengths were, and so I had to do it again. It turns out my biggest strength is showing love, which I haven't quite figured out how to apply that to work yet, but I assume it's like, I don't know, I can only guess like showing appreciation for other people and celebrating their success. So that's for me. Okay, let's talk about engagement. This is great. Engagement is one of my favorite topics, even though I have to say this name again. So engagement is being one with the music is what it's sometimes called. It's like this deeper happiness there, like you're really there, you're really engaged and with what you're doing, right? So this is such an important concept that it sort of spawned this whole subfield that you may have heard of. It's called flow. It's the same kind of concept, like losing track of time, being right there, being completely absorbed by what you're doing, right? So the credit for first studying this goes again to Csikszentmihalyi. Sorry, I really tried. It's a very difficult name for me to pronounce, but in any case, you will see this all over the books. If you read books, like this shows up over and over again. How do you put yourself in a position where you are completely absorbed by your work? Now, reflect on that a little bit. When was the last time you were completely absorbed by what you were doing? For me, it happens to be right now because, you know, I love doing this kind of thing. But what people found is that there is this axis, you know, if you look at the x-axis being skills and the y-axis being challenges, there is this, I guess they call it a flow channel, right? So there's this area in the middle that if you're in the sweet spot area, then you can really thrive and you can, you know, lose track of time, be engaged, and also learn. This is also the sweet spot for learning. So you don't want to be too much on the boredom axis and too much on the anxiety axis, right? Now, this is a really good time to talk about job and job change, right? As you think about if you're, you know, for your job, do you fall most of the time within that flow channel, right? What happens sometimes to people is when they change jobs, you know, they're more on the anxiety side, and that's okay, right? Like they're being well pushed out of their comfort zone, and maybe they can catch up. But if you're constantly on that side, then it's really time to change something, right? Whereas if you're always all the time bored, that's also the time to change something. And I feel like oftentimes people don't think about this very explicitly, but once they see something like this, they're like, oh yeah, that actually kind of makes sense. So if you're a leader in our organizations, you know, we see this all the time where people, you know, become more comfortable, then they become complacent or bored or whatever. You really need to push them out of their comfort zones a little bit, and then they end up being happier and more productive. Okay, so what do you do to get into this state of flow? A lot of the things that we've already talked about, using your character strengths, doing the things you love, meditate, and exercise. Spend time in nature. So I hope that all of you already love to exercise and love to meditate. If not, this is your opportunity. Let's talk a little bit about relationships. So relationships, you know, obviously we're talking about positive relationships here. And this has been, of course, for the last couple of years, a very difficult topic for many of us because it's been so isolating. You know, we're back together in person for the first time at a conference. A lot of us still work from home. You know, we're starting to come back into the office. And, you know, a lot of us are seeing, you know, far away loved ones for the first time again in person. So this has been really hard. It's very clear that positive relationships are a good predictor of pretty much everything in life, right? Not just being successful at work. Longevity is one of them. Good health is another. So if there's anything you can take away from this talk, if you forget everything else, positive relationships are very critical to success. That's pretty well understood. So let's talk about one thing. Why does this matter to this talk here, right? So oftentimes when I talk to people, they're like, yeah, you know, I have my group of friends and I have my family. Super important, I get it. But what about your relationships at work? I remember when I first started out, you know, in my first jobs, I remember I was definitely more in the anxiety part of this flow chart that we saw. And I just could not fathom hanging out with friends, with colleagues outside of talking about work, right? I would show up at work, we would have work conversations, but I couldn't fathom, you know, going beyond that. And I think over time, what I've learned is that, and also what I read in the literature, is that our brains really don't make a difference between people that we know from conferences or from the dog park and people that we know from work. So it's actually really important to treat those relationships with care, and that doesn't mean that we're going to be friends with everybody that we work with. I suspect that's true for many of us, but it's probably also true for many of us that we will find people at work that we connect with, and that are truly our friends and that we have important relationships with. One story that may resonate with some of you is that you know, we also work from home at Google for a very long time. And last year we had like a summit, and it was all online, and we talked about work all day long. And then we actually, a few of us, somebody had organized a get-together in a park. And this was with mostly people that are more senior than me, so definitely pushing me a little bit out of my comfort zone, but many of whom I knew. And I signed up, I'm like, I'm gonna go. And then the day came, and I'm like, oh, I'm really kind of anxious about this. I haven't seen anybody in person in ages, and I almost didn't go. And of course I went, and it was so much fun. It was like kind of ridiculous how happy I was afterwards, just to have seen people in person. So I don't know if you had similar experiences to that, but I was like on cloud 9. It was kind of ridiculous. I still talk about that day, and I just like last week talked with somebody, and I'm like, oh, remember that day in the park? It was so much fun. So again, treat those things with care. Think about them, and just remember that it's not, you know, it's also the impact that you have on the people around you, right? So if you're open to, you know, to treating these relationships with care, it makes a big difference on our teams as well.